introduce Amir, who will speak briefly after David and will hopefully help us answer the questions that you would raise. He has recently produced a 600-page document on the struggles of the Iranian working class, 21st of March 2007 to 21st of March 2008. And some of David's talk is based on those documents. It's a summary of the kind of struggles that exist in Iran. And it just gives only one faction, or a very little, about the daily struggles of Iranian workers. It will not by any means cover every aspect of Iranian workers' struggles, but I think between the two of them, Amir, in his brief introduction after David, and in responding to the questions and in the descriptions of what is going on with the Iranian workers, we can give you some idea about what's going on amongst the Iranian workers. So, David.
Thank you. HOPI is an anti-war campaign opposing what seems to be very likely to be American and or other Western military intervention in Iran. And I note that not very much has been said about this so far today. But given that, it's worthwhile asking why we are having a section on Iranian workers in a conference such as today. After all, on the one hand, the official anti-war movement would suggest that perhaps this is a purely internal conflict between the Iranian government and its workers, that it's an economic issue rather than a political one, and therefore it's not an issue which we should particularly be discussing. On the other hand, socialist imperialists, for example, might well contend that Western military intervention may be beneficial for Iranian workers and their trade union rights. HOPI clearly rejects both positions, and some of the reasons for this have already been given, and so I'm going to expand on them. One is that the effect of sanctions, modest though it is as yet, is going to intensify, and that this weight will especially fall on Iranian workers rather than the rich in Iran. A second reason is that given the political system in Iran, the effect of sanctions is going to be to intensify conflict between Iranian workers on the one hand and employers and the state on the other, and that this is going to intensify existing trends which have led to considerable upsurge in strikes and other forms of industrial conflict over the past year or two. And another one is that the Iranian workers themselves who have been involved in these struggles, for example, the bus workers of Tehran, have been quite explicit in saying that their struggles with the Iranian state and their employers shouldn't be used to justify Western military intervention, thus refuting, for example, people like Nick Cohen and others in Britain who have argued precisely this, that Western military intervention can be used to help liberate Iranian workers. And so it's some of these issues that we're going to be looking at today. Now then, the effects of sanctions, as I said, has been to intensify some trends which have been resulting in increasing conflict between Iranian workers and their employers. What are these? These, I think, are in particular the development of what we're all familiar with in calling neoliberal policies, which have been on the rise really since the late 1980s in Iran, which are especially reflected in increasing privatization of Iranian companies, And while privatisation isn't in itself the cause of industrial conflicts, it's intensified them. Privatisation itself has taken on a movement of its own, really, in the last few years. The Iranian government is promising or threatening, according to how you might interpret it, to privatise almost all of the industry which was nationalised after the revolution in 1979, with the exception, quite crucially, of course, of the oil industry. So this would include big industries such as cars, which we've had some contact with car workers in Iran. So the big car firms in Iran have already been nationalised, and other firms as well.
Privatised.
I was testifying.
We are paying attention.
Thanks. Excuse me, privatised recently. And another major feature, trend which lies behind a lot of the conflict related to privatisation, although preceding it, is the spread of contract work and casualisation in Iran. Now then, in Britain and other Western countries, we're not unfamiliar with the growth, for example, of part-time work or contract work. In Iran, this has represented a much greater shift in the policies of employers from a situation where, although imperfectly, I'm not trying to suggest here that we should be defending the Islamic Republic in its early years, although to some people in Iran this seems a bit like a golden age now, in the same way as the years in which many of us were brought up politically in the after-war period in Britain probably seems like a bit of a golden age as well. But nevertheless, labour legislation passed after the 1979 revolution did lead to relative stability of employment. Casualisation of work, which is especially the employment of workers on 3-month contracts and less, spread initially by employers to try and undercut that labour legislation. But in the last decade or so, this process of casualisation has been assisted by the Iranian government itself, which has pretty much abolished all of its labour legislation now. And again, it was the Iranian Minister of Labour who promised and or threatened that in about a year or so, 80% of the Iranian workforce would be on short-term contracts. And this is always, especially as we have seen in the car factories, always especially manual production workers, not the managerial or semi-managerial white-collar workers. And so industrial actions of the kind which Amir has researched have been especially defensive actions by workers against actions taken by employers, such as the introduction or the spread of short-term contracts. Workers paid on short-term contracts are, of course, less well paid than those on contracts. They are temporarily paid. They don't get a whole bunch of insurance benefits, which you will get after 3 months' employment, which is precisely, of course, why managers like them. They were not covered by the labour legislation. As Christine said in her talk, it's impossible to disentangle sanctions and their effect as it's happened from what would have happened anyway. But undoubtedly, the closures of workplaces have been excused by employers as inevitable as a result of sanctions. And as Tora said this morning, in fact, many employers are quite happy to close down their factories if they can sell it off, build a block of flats, transfer the money to California and then move. It's not as if all employers are desperately keen to keep their workplaces open. If they think they can make a load of workers redundant, sell the workplace and then transfer their money abroad. And consequently, with closures has come large numbers of redundancies and large numbers of workers losing their job. But another feature of the work situation in Iran, quite widespread, especially in the smaller enterprises, and the vast bulk, the vast majority of Iranian workers do not work in the big oil refineries or some of the big factories like car factories. They work in small workshops, for example in the textile industry, where many women are employed as well as men. Here, the systematic non-payment of wages, frequently lasting for months, has been a feature that workers have been increasingly protesting about. And this is connected with what I was talking about before, because frequently workers have found that managements who have not paying their wages have been doing so as a prelude to closing the factory down and everybody losing their jobs. So these protests and their demands have been economic, they have been defensive, but it hasn't been long before, especially when industrial action has taken place, that they've taken on a political hue as well, either because their leaders have been arrested, which has been the case with bus workers, these sugarcane hack workers recently, and in others. And also, as was mentioned this morning, when strike leaders are arrested and jailed or put on trial, they are treated as agents of a foreign power. Yeah? And again, it's the looming conflict with America which is allowing the regime to portray strike leaders as national traitors, yeah? The agents of foreign powers. So this is the first place in which the state has become involved, and workers engaging in what might appear to be at the beginning economic or industrial actions have confronted the state. Another one is the way in which the workers, in order to pursue their demands, have been adding on to these economic demands for independent representation, for some form of trade union rights. Because this is denied to them by the Iranian state. The only form of worker representation allowed is these Islamic councils which are set up in factories between workers and employers, and which are linked together in a higher organisation called Khane Kargar, Workers' House, which is representing them. Increasingly, workers are bypassing these institutions. They see them as completely useless in representing their demands. They see them for what they are, which is really agents of the management on the shop floor. So this is a background to some of the recent disputes going on really for the last 2.5 years that Amir has begun to document. So what form do these protests take? Well, initially they tended to be quite modest. They were, for example, petitions by workers who hadn't had their wages paid to a local authority, or attempts to get their interests secured through their local mosque, for example. Perhaps a sympathetic mullah could take their demands upstairs. Or they might have been, for example, short-term stoppages within a workplace to express a grievance or promote a demand. However, the way that managers and the state have responded to these protests has led to their intensification, because, as I've mentioned, the state has responded with arrests. Employers have responded with sackings. Last year, 50 workers from Iran Hodro, the Wet car factory, were simply dismissed. And this is after they won one of their strikes. This is an old pattern that existed under the Shah, where sometimes the Shah would allow managers to capitulate to a worker's demand in order that the strike didn't become public and gain support. And then after the struggle had finished and the workers had won some of their demands, they got some of the ringleaders, as they called them, and sacked them. And also within every workplace, there's what is it, Hasarat? Hasarat is an internal police organisation which exists within all Iranian workplace, in the bigger workplace, tends to consist of kind of semi-managerial workers, foremen, a few white-collar workers and so on, whose job it is to try and disrupt protests and to target and to discover who are the ringleaders in protests. So this, in a sense, politicisation of disputes has meant in the last year or two they've become much more visible and much more public. So, for example, they have consisted of public protests. Many of the small workshops in the textile industry have seen, for example, workers blocking roads. In a recent dispute by tyre workers, they actually put the tyres in the road and set fire to them. In small towns, like with these Haft sugar workers in the southwest of Iran, they've consisted of public demonstrations, strictly speaking banned, to try and advance their demands. They've consisted in some cases of what employers have called kidnapping. It's not literally kidnapping, but where the employers, the owners, the foremen have been kind of locked in their offices by the workers until the workers are trying to get some of their demands. And they've also consisted of larger strikes. They've also, quite crucially, consisted of expressions of messages of solidarity between workers. Iran Hodro workers, car workers, have been quite good at giving messages of solidarity to other workers, especially in Tehran, and in some cases providing speakers at their rallies. This is the particular symbolism of May Day demonstrations in Iran, which the government has tried to clamp down on in the past few years, where all workers from different workplaces have gathered together, and this is potentially a very subversive form of activity for the regime, which is why they've tried to clamp down and arrest some of the leaders as these demonstrations have been taking place. Now then, these struggles have indeed been intensifying precisely as the threat of war looms. The Iranian government and the employers have been absolutely making no concessions to workers because of the international situation. On the contrary, they've been using the international situation to justify their policies of repression. Amongst the workers themselves who have been engaging in these actions, it would be wrong, I think, to say that there is a working class movement in Iran. There are elements of a working class movement. And within these movements, a number of debates amongst workers have been taking place about, if you like, how far should they try and take their struggles. And inevitably there are some differences within workplaces and also between workplaces about how this should take place. How public should these demonstrations be? Should the strikes simply try and remain within the workplace? Because when they are in the workplace, the leaders of these strikes and sit-ins have to try and remain secret, otherwise the management will get them. Or should they try and become more public, going outside the workplace to try and win more popular sympathy, as the sugar workers have in the southwest of Iran? And at the same time, they've been posing issues about what kind of demands should they be putting forward. Should they try and stick to purely economic demands, or should they try and coalesce together to put forward political demands, for example, over trade union rights and workers' representations? So all these things have been taking place as the threat of war looms. It is our view in HOPI that we should, in addition, as an accompaniment to our work of exposing and opposing the war aims of the Americans and other Western powers, give our firm support to these workers' struggles. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, but when the bus workers went on strike, it was no friend of the American working class, George W. Bush, who sent them a message of solidarity. And this is what some of the students who we've been talking to say: unless we do support their demands, then it may be that some workers will start looking abroad for some kinds of support. So we strongly believe that we should be giving them our support, and albeit in a very limited way, in my view, we can actually make a difference. We can actually make a difference. As this student was saying, the workers who have received support from abroad, from within the anti-war movements, are quite aware of this fact, are quite grateful for this fact, in a situation in Iran where individual struggles still are very atomized, where individuals, like the student's spokesman, is still very vulnerable to imprisonment and repression. Even the very limited support which we can offer can be valued. Okay, thank you.
من قبل از هر چیز از شماها به خاطر شرکتتون توی این کنفرانس و این هوای خیلی خوب تشکر میکنم. دو تا نکته داشتم از دیوید عزیزم که رفیق دیوید که زحمت بیان این مطلب من کشید، سپاسگزارم. این مطلبی که من نوشتم در واقع حاصل 5000 خبره که من 2000 تقریبا 50 تا خبر کارگری رو از مارس 2007 تا مارس 2008 یعنی یک سال جمع کردم و به عنوان روز شمار یک سال جنبش کارگری عرضه کردم.
Okay, well, first of all, I think on behalf of one of the organizations that participates in Hopi Workers' Led Unity Iran, Amir was thanking all of you for being here. The records that he took of the years that he looked at added to 5,000 workers' disputes. So the record is available now of, if you like, he's gone day by day and collected this 21st of March 2007, as I said earlier, to 21st of March 2008. That alone is 5,000 disputes.
اون چه که بیان در واقع نظر من از این خبرها، همه اونها رو شما میتونید توی این نمایشگاه عکسی که هست که 90 تا عکس رو با خودش داره ببینید. در این مجموعه غیر از 4 تا عکس که مربوط به سالهای پیشه، یکیش اعدام فعالان سیاسی توی کردستان و اعدام‌های دست جمعی که مربوط به سالهای پیشه، همه این عکس‌ها مبارزات جنبش‌های اجتماعی ایران رو اهم از زنان، دانشجویان، به ویژه کارگران توی همین یک سال آخر هم که مبارزات کارگران کرد.
Here. Many of them cover workers' struggles, but they also, as you move on, will also cover students' and women's struggles in Iran. In particular, he wants to draw your attention to the photographs of sugarcane workers. They've been mentioned a few times today, and they are in the forefront of the workers' struggles right now. They have been on strike for a few months in 2007, and then again most of the spring of this year. They haven't been paid, and the photographs at the end depict those who have been arrested. There are 8 workers arrested. We are trying to campaign for their release. Not as well known as Osanlu, but we are trying to campaign for them. And what he's trying to show with most of the protests that you will see is that these are happening under severe repression, when there is the Revolutionary Guards attacking people, when there are workers getting arrested, and there is Hezbollah acting against ordinary Iranians. So in the break between the 2 sessions, he's encouraging you to do that. I'm now opening the session to contributions, questions, debates, etc.
I want to come back on what's been discussed now, but I also want to mention what was. I want to link that to the discussion we were having just beforehand. I think it's obvious for anyone who looks at what's happening in Iran that this is an anti-working class regime, which it's not possible for the Iranian working class to form any kind of united front or alliance, and so I think it should be obvious that as partisans of the international working class, we also are unable to form any kind of united front or alliance with the Iranian regime. That doesn't preclude us from also opposing our own ruling class and US imperialism. The burning question for us is, on what basis do we establish independent working class, an independent working class campaign, independent working class and independent working class parties? What kind of alliances we ought to form with other social forces and so on. Iran, I think, is, over the last 30 years, and as Torab explained, for longer than that, is a testing ground in which we can look at the kind of responses that the left has come up with over the last 100 years. And I also think it's obvious that the left has been found wanting in that regard. Even if you go back to the 1920s and the policies which the Commonwealth and the Third International was formulating then in terms of a united anti-imperialist front, might listen about that kind of thing. And the consequences of that, the potential consequences of that in terms of in Turkey, right next door to Iran, and even in the Gilan Republic itself, after the Anglo-Soviet for communists in Iran itself, and afterwards in China. Everyone knows about 1927, the massacres in Shanghai and so on. What we saw after 1979 was a replay of that, but when the left ought to have had all the lessons of that, and when also the political economy of the world had been pretty much transformed from the early 1920s. Because in the early 1920s you did have non-capitalist, pre-capitalist regimes. In 1979 that was not the case, and it's not the case now. Where I part company with my own comrades in the CPGB, or those who've spoken today, is in believing that you have to justify, I mean, there seems to be a belief that you have to justify opposition to the Iranian regime on the basis that it's in some kind of alliance with US imperialism. I think that's a bad mistake, and it's a failure, as I was trying to argue this morning, to break out, to think anew about what anti-capitalism and anti-imperialist policy ought to entail. Now, what is the Iranian regime? I think it is in genuine conflict with US imperialism. I think there are genuine points of conflict between the two. It's not working class anti-imperialism. It's not trying to transform the nature of the world's system. So therefore, there are points on which they also agree. But if you ask, why is the US trying to conducting its anti-Iranian campaign? Why has it got sanctions against Iran? Why is it upping the ante? Why is it talking about war against Iran? Why might it actually strike Iran? And I don't think it's because Iran is in any way a client state of the United States, or that the United States is creating some artificial bogey or N. It's true there are internal driving forces within the United States itself. There is a military-industrial complex, so there are drives to war and so on. But I would argue that the reason that the United States sees Iran as an enemy is precisely the role that Iran plays in Afghanistan and Iraq. The United States has found itself with a nightmare that it's invaded both Afghanistan and Iraq, and by doing so finds that it's actually strengthened the Iranian regime. And it's because it's not happy with that. It's not because that's the outcome it desires, but it cannot achieve its ends in the region while the Iranian regime remains intact. If you look at what's happening in Iraq, it's not that they want to create a client state of Iran in Iraq, which is precisely what I don't think they want to do. It's because they want to create a US client regime in Iraq that they need to weaken Iran and, if possible, overthrow the regime in Iran. And I think any other understanding of the situation is simplistic, is not really attempting to shift the theoretical framework in which we think about these issues, and actually seems to me just completely off the wall. But hey, no doubt something to say about me.
Yeah, I've got a question. What's the national coordination between the different workers' struggles, different strikes and movements and councils? And what's the national coordination with the students' movement and the works movement? Do they work together? Do they organise joint demonstrations?
Okay, I think I'll allow people to answer, because I don't want the discussion to be diverted back to what we didn't finish last session. I'm sorry, but we do have to try and...
I'd like to get back in.
Yeah. Go on.
You'll never do that again.
So do you want me to ask?
Can you perhaps add one little point about what contribution just was in relation to David's contribution? David, who seems to know quite a lot about not just the working class in general, or in particular in Iran, but with that kind of knowledge, I would assume that he also has sufficient knowledge about working class history in the United Kingdom. And so therefore, when it goes to labeling strike leaders as traitors during intense conflict, I would try to remind David on the strike leaders of the miners in the 40s here in the United Kingdom, who were, of course, exactly the same way treated, like he is very intensely and in a very intense solidarity with our Iranian comrades protesting about. So perhaps he can explain us how come that I would assume that he was on the side of the miners. I would strongly assume that he was on the side of the miners here in the 40s, when they were accused as being traitors. And how can he then equalize that with the charge which came from there? That, of course, the big task of the overclass, I use a term by our Japanese comrades, overclass are about 30,000 individuals who do not pay taxes to any sovereign territory, and who in the moment have gigantic power in terms of the evaluation of the dollar, and also, of course, of the machination of the derivatives, which give us a great problem now with increased prices for food and oil. So in which way he actually tells that with his strong demands about that we should shift our alliances and basically support the sugar workers and their strike leaders without taking sufficient concern about the desperate situation in which the regime itself finds itself, which is comparable with the desperate regime in which Churchill found himself in the 40s when Dunkirk happened.
Do you want to briefly answer this, or shall I just ask Anna?
Were you on the side of Churchill or something?
I also supported the miners during the 1970s when Margaret Thatcher called them the enemy within.
So I welcome that very much of you. I can see.
I don't see any contradiction in supporting the miners then and supporting the sugar workers now. But perhaps we can take it up afterwards.
Yeah.
No, I totally agree.
Okay.
The question is how is your attitude to Churchill's desperate situation of Dunkirk and to the regime in moment in
Okay. Can I please ask not to have people, can you answer Chris's and then...
اوکی. ببینید اون چه که به عنوان تشکل کارگری در ایران به ویژه وجه سراسریش مهمه اینه که امروز خواست تشکل سراسری و سراسری کردن مبارزات کارگران در درون کشور بیش از هر موقعی شنیده میشه. منتها بحث اساسی و بحث اصلی اینه که موانعی که برای سازماندیابی تشکلات کارگری در ایران به سایر تشکل‌های مستقل هست، اونها رو باید باز بشناسیم. در مرحله اول استبداد سیاسی حاکم که توسط نظام سرمایه‌داری جمهوری اسلامی اعمال میشه خودش مانع مقدم شکلگیری این گونه تشکلات. در ایران کارفرمایان برای خودشون متشکلند، نیروی تشکل‌های در واقع اطلاعاتی و شبه کارگری خانه کارگر، انجمن‌های اسلامی و همینطور بازار دیگر نیروها متشکلند، ولی از این سو حتی اون گرایشی که میخواد در چارچوب قانون اساسی خودش متشکل بکنه براش امکان تشکل پذیری تحت هیچ شرایطی نیست. چرا؟ به خاطر اینکه اینها بر آنن، یعنی حکومت حاکم بر آنه که هر گونه تشکل پذیری در هر سطحی، چه برای دانشجویان، چه برای زنان، چه برای کارگران و زحمتکشان، این ظرفیت رو در اونها در واقع وسعت میده که بخوان قدم به قدم جلوتر بیان و بتونن خودشون رو در اشل سراسری بنابراین این مانع همواره امکان شکلگیری تشکلات رو حتی در چارچوب خواستای در واقع قانونی هم امکان ناپذیر میکنه.
Okay. There is a great wish for national coordination amongst Iranian workers. They face many obstacles towards this, not just the ones that were earlier mentioned. I won't go into them, the Islamic councils, the police in the factory and so on, the dictatorship of the state. But also even the factions that once, and there is a lot of debate amongst the Iranian working class about whether they should do this legally or illegally, whether within the framework of the state, the current constitution, they should move forward towards organizing national organizations, or they should move beyond that. Even that section that wants to remain within the constitution cannot move because of the obstacles we mentioned, because the state stops any coordination on a national level from that point of view. There are, however, and you will see from some of the other photos that we have, that there are two major national organizations coordinating the workers, roughly divided along the should we be open, should we within the constitution, or should we be totally secret and illegal. And those two organizations do work occasionally together, but there are a lot of arguments. If you follow the debates within the Iranian working class, you see that that is the dominant arguments amongst various forces. And those two sections do argue issues such as the two are the Free Trade Union of Iran, and it's an unfortunate name they've chosen, but it's called اتحادیه کارگران آزاد ایران, and the other one is the Comité پیگیری برای ایجاد تشکل‌های مستقل کارگری, the Committee for the Setting Up of Independent Workers' Organizations. They do go for long names. And the second one is probably the one that is going far beyond the Constitution. Ben.
Yeah, I'd like to thank both comments for the contribution. I think it's a very worthy task, actually, collating all of these struggles, particularly as Thomas mentioned, that there's a good chance that these struggles will continue to intensify, to deepen, and to, I think, in that sense, this debate on legal methods will actually unfold as well, and actually going out, daring to act more publicly, etc., because conditions aren't easy for our comrades in Iran. So I do think that it's an extremely important task to put these things together. And just doing some of the interviews last week with Iranian students, they were saying one of the problems is precisely that our struggles, particularly worker struggles, aren't heard across the country. The media don't want to know, etc., etc. So I think that is it's an important task for us to play. And I would there's a qualifier in that sense, and I think David hits the point exactly well, because it's the question of the political framework in which we do this, and how we articulate support for our comrades in Iran. Because there is a danger, given the increased war threat and this ratcheting up of pressure on Iran at the moment, that certain forces try and manipulate these genuine movements for democracy and change from below, and manipulate them in their own image. There's a whole history of it in terms of the forces of imperialism intervening in its own interest for regime change, as it would like to see it. And I think that's, David's exactly right, that's what we must avoid, and that's precisely why Hands of the People of Iran has the political emphasis it does. So it's not just about calling for an abstract solidarity in that sense. It has a clear political framework in which it articulates these politics. And like I say, related to what Nick was talking about, looking to provide some sort of political alternative which is free of the moribund forces of imperialism and also the Iranian theocratic regime. And it's an important point because even though it hasn't become that much of an issue yet, we have seen small examples precisely of rather questionable, dubious political forces trying to hijack good causes of the workers in Iran. And the recent one was the March 6th event called by the ITF and the ITUC. That underlines precisely the solidarity that we have to argue against and fight against, because these unions have a particular dodgy record when it comes to solidarity, as we all know. There have been attempts before by Iranian comrades to raise the struggle of Iranian, raise the profile of Iranian workers' struggles with these people, and they just, forget it, they're not interested at all. But now suddenly that there's a threat of war on Iran, they're suddenly interested. And basically how it works is sort of self-appointed bureaucrats who sit around in a room, write out a letter to this or that transport union and this or that other union and say, well, hey, do you want to affiliate? And then suddenly they've got a lot of work. So I'm not saying we remove ourselves from these struggles, but we have to actually go into these struggles and articulate the politics which are necessary, i.e. free of these rotten patterns. I think that's a struggle we will constantly have to wage, because, like I said, we have to understand ourselves in the first instance as an anti-war campaign. That's what we're about. But as comrades have pointed out in the first couple of sessions today, you cannot really be genuinely anti-war unless you are looking to build these links with the Iranian masses in struggle. I think I have to make a wonderful comment in terms of this report. I hope we can get it into English and get it out. It's quite long. But I think if we could spread it out, because it's of interest to people involved in the anti-war campaign, and so I think it would be of interest to get that out, and it's very commendable work which we can use to make our own propaganda for independent working class politics across the world.
John.
Yeah, I wanted to really just add in on, because I just asked you on the way in, anyway, stole my thunder. But yeah, I think that I just wanted to take up what Ben was talking about, because I think in Hopi we have got, you know, a difficult path to walk. That it is very easy for us to slip into. We're just against the theocracy, we're just against the Ayatollahs because what a barbaric regime that is. And if we simply emphasise that, then I think we make a great mistake. And the danger is, of course, that in that sense we become what we're often accused of, wrongly, and that is being dupes of imperialism. Because if all we went on about is the barbarism of the Ayatollahs and how bad the Tehran regime is, we forget who our main enemy is. And of course our main enemy is international imperialism, specifically the United States, which I believe, although I may be, Nick, is looking for enemies. And I don't look around the world in terms of the United States and say that this is irrational, but there is, in its rationality, there's quite clearly an irrationality taking place. In that sense, the United States looked around for enemies, it looks around to refashion the world, and in the process it actually reveals its own weakness, and I think it actually accelerates its own weakness by what it's doing. But I really don't think that we can explain it any other way, and I certainly don't think or I've heard anyone here simply say that Tehran is merely some sort of puppet of the United States. I don't think anyone suggested that. I think what is being suggested is that we do not live in a world as actually said. Well, I think that I think he was actually making that point. Actually, if I heard him right, I might be wrong. And I don't want to defend what Mike said. It's bound to be wrong. But if he did say that, it was wrong. But I think what he was saying, if I heard him right, is he was talking about the role of Saddam Hussein. But the real point I want to make is really this, and that is, if you take Tehran, and if you take the United States, it has been described by certain sections of the left, including in the Middle East, that we live in a world that's characterised by terrorism, i.e. the terrorism of Islamic fundamentalism, the terrorism of the United States and the equal, or some other version of that. And I think the correct approach that we've got to have is that Tehran, although it's on the list of the United States' most evil powers, although the Republican Guard is on the list of officially classified as a terrorist organisation, literally tomorrow, love could break out. Official love could break out between the United States and Tehran. That's really what we need to understand. Exactly in the same way, or actually in a similar way, that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were bitter enemies until they signed a peace deal. And the Soviet Union were allies of the United States until the Cold War. So the point that is being emphasised, I would say anyway, is that Tehran, right, is anti-working class, right? Of course it is prepared to cooperate with the United States, and the United States is prepared to cooperate with it. And that can include war, but it could also, as I said, actually lead to the outbreak of some other deal between the two. Anyway, the last point is really just back onto this whole question of the line that we have to tread. Because as I say, we could tread the line of it's Tehran that's the problem, but there is also another side to that, and I think we see in terms of the other side, if we want an example of it, and that's the SWP. I mean, I almost couldn't believe it when I read their review. I'm bound to pronounce it wrongly. Persepolis. Not bad. That's good. That's what I'm going to do. You know the film. Well, you know the film, right? But the fact that the reviewer in Socialist Worker described that as distorted, the fact that they described it as peddling lies, the fact that they criticise it, this is one individual's experience. In other words, they actually went to the position of actually becoming not only, in that sense, defenders of the Tehran regime, but the most abysmal apologists. So I do think that we have a line to tread. It is a difficult line. The pressures are going to be on us from both sides. But I think in general, Hopi thus far has got it more or less right. Although there was, I think, some differences in our ranks over the particular demonstration that Ben referred to. Some comrades, for example, from Iran did express to me that we got it wrong. I actually think that we got it right. We actually turned up with a leaflet saying, we're here, we're in solidarity with our comrades in Iran, but we're not in solidarity with people like Peter Hain, who are playing the role of imperialist Jews. Now that was criticised. That leaflet was criticised. Personally, I would defend that leaflet. I think that was the right approach, both to turn up, as Ben said, to participate in that protest, not to take